Chapter 44. Wives of the Apostles, Mrs. Orson Hyde, Incidents of the Early Days, The Prophet, Mary Ann Pratt's Life Story, Wife of Gen. Charles C. Rich, Mrs. Franklin D. Richards, Phoebe Woodruff, Leonora Taylor, Marion Ross Pratt. The Wife of Delegate Cannon, Violet Kimball again. The life of Mrs. Orson Hyde is replete with incidents of the early days, including the shameful occurrence of the tarring and feathering of the prophet, which took place while he was at her father's house. Her maiden name was Miranda M. Johnson, she being the daughter of John and Elsa Johnson, a family well known among the pioneer converts of Ohio. She was born in Pomfret, Windsor County, Vermont, June 28, 1815. In February of 1818, she says, "My father, in company with several families from the same place, emigrated to Hiram, Portage County, Ohio. In the winter of 1831, Ezra Booth, a Methodist minister, procured a copy of the Book of Mormon and brought it to my father's house. They sat up all night reading it and were very much exercised over it. As soon as they heard that Joseph Smith had arrived in Kirtland, Mr. Booth and wife and my father and mother went immediately to see him. They were convinced and baptized before they returned. They invited the prophet and Elder Rigdon to accompany them home, which they did, and preached several times to crowded congregations, baptizing quite a number. I was baptized in April following. The next fall Joseph came with his family to live at my father's house. He was at that time translating the Bible, and Elder Rigdon was acting as scribe. The following spring, a mob, disguising themselves as black men, gathered and burst into his sleeping apartment one night and dragged him from the bed where he was nursing a sick child. They also went to the house of Elder Rigdon and took him out with Joseph into an orchard, where, after choking and beating them, they tarred and feathered them and left them nearly dead. My father, at the first onset, started to the rescue, but was knocked down and lay senseless for some time. Here I feel like bearing my testimony that during the whole year that Joseph was an inmate of my father's house, I never saw aught in his daily life or conversation to make me doubt his divine mission. In 1833 we moved to Kirtland, and in 1834 I was married to Orson Hyde and became fully initiated into the cares and duties of a missionary's wife. My husband, in common with most of the elders, giving his time and energies to the work of the ministry. In the summer of 1837, leaving me with a 3-week-old babe, he, in company with Heber C. Kimball and others, went on their first mission to England. Shortly after his return, in the summer of 1838, we, in company with several other families, went to Missouri, where we remained till the next spring. We then went to Nauvoo. In the spring of 1840, Mr. Hyde went on his mission to Palestine, going in the apostolic style, without purse or scrip, preaching his way, and when all other channels were closed, teaching the English language in Europe, till he gained sufficient money to take him to the Holy Land, where he offered up his prayer on the Mount of Olives, and dedicated Jerusalem to the gathering of the Jews in this dispensation. Having accomplished a 3 years' mission, he returned, and shortly after, in accordance with the revelation on celestial marriage, and with my full consent, married 2 more wives. At last we were forced to flee from Nauvoo, and in the spring of 1846, we made our way to Council Bluffs, where our husband left us to go again on mission to England. On his return, in the fall of 1847, he was appointed to take charge of the saints in the States, and to send off the emigration as fast as it arrived in a suitable condition on the frontiers, also to edit a paper in the church interest, the name of which was Frontier Guardian. In the summer of 1852, we brought our family safely through to Salt Lake City, where we have had peace and safety ever since. In 1868, I was chosen to preside over the branch of the Female Relief Society of the ward in which I reside, the duties of which position I have prayerfully attempted to perform. Mary Ann Pratt deserves mention next. It will be remembered that the Apostle Parley P. Pratt lost his first wife at the birth of his eldest son. He afterwards married the subject of the sketch, and she becomes historically important from the fact that she was one of the first of those self-subduing women who united with their husbands in establishing the law of celestial marriage, or the patriarchal order. She gave to her husband other wives. Taking up the story of her life with her career as a Latter-day Saint, she says, "I was baptized into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in the spring of 1835, being convinced of the truthfulness of its doctrines by the first sermon I heard, and I said in my heart, if there are only 3 who hold firm to the faith, I will be one of that number. And through all the persecution I have had to endure, I have ever felt the same. My heart has never swerved from that resolve." I was married to Parley P. Pratt in the spring of 1837, and moving to Missouri, endured with him the persecution of the saints, so often recorded in history. When my husband was taken by a mob in the city of Far West, MO, and carried to prison, I was confined to my bed with raging fever and not able to help myself at all, with a babe 3 months old and my little girl of 5 years, but I cried mightily to the Lord for strength to endure. And he in mercy heard my prayer and carried me safely through. In a few days word came to me that my husband was in prison and in chains. As soon as my health was sufficiently restored, I took my children and went to him. I found him released from his chains and was permitted to remain with him. I shared his dungeon, which was a damp, dark, filthy place, without ventilation, merely having a small grating on one side. In this we were obliged to sleep. About the middle of March I bid adieu to my beloved companion and returned to Far West to make preparations for leaving the state. Through the kind assistance of Brother David W. Rogers, now an aged resident of Provo, I removed to Quincy, Illinois, where I remained until the arrival of Mr. Pratt, after his fortunate escape from prison, where he had been confined 8 months without any just cause. Passing briefly over the intervening years, in which I accompanied my husband on various missions, first to New York, and thence to England, where I remained 2 years, and, returning to Nauvoo, our sojourn in that beautiful city a few years, and our final expulsion and the final weary gathering to Utah, I hasten to bear my testimony to the world that this is the Church and people of God, and I pray that I may be found worthy of a place in his celestial kingdom. The tragedy of the close of the mortal career of Parley P. Pratt is still fresh in the public mind. It is one of the terrible chapters of Mormon history which the pen of his wife has not dared to touch. Another of these first wives is presented in the person of Sister Rich. Sarah D. P. Rich, wife of General Chas C. Rich and daughter of John and Elizabeth P., was born September 23 d. 1814 in St. Clair County, Illinois. In December 1835, she became a member of the Church of Latter-day Saints and had the pleasure shortly after of seeing her father's family, with a single exception, converted to the same faith. In 1837, they removed to Far West, MO, where the saints were at that time gathering. At this place she for the first time met Mr. Rich, to whom she was married on the 11th of February, 1838. During the autumn of 1838, the mob having driven many of the saints from their homes in the vicinity, she received into her house and sheltered no less than 7 families of the homeless outcasts. Among the number was the family of Apostle Page, and it was during her sojourn with Mrs. Rich that Apostle Page's wife died. Mrs. R. stood in her door and saw the infamous mob leader and Methodist preacher, Bogard, shoot at her husband as he was returning from the mob camp under a flag of truce. That night Mr. Rich was compelled to flee for his life, and she did not see him again until she joined him 3 months later on the bank of the Mississippi, opposite Quincy. They made the crossing in a canoe, the river being so full of ice that the regular ferry boat could not be used. From this place they removed to Nauvoo, where she remained daring all the succeeding persecutions and trials of the Church until February 1846, when they were forced to leave, which they did, with her 3 small children, crossing the Mississippi on the ice. Journeying westward to Mount Pisgah, Iowa, they remained during the following season and planted and harvested a crop of corn. In the spring of 1847, they removed to winter quarters, and 6 weeks afterwards started out on the weary journey across the plains. She arrived in Salt Lake Valley on the 2nd of October, 1847, with the second company of emigrants, of which her husband was the leader. Since that time, she has resided continually in Salt Lake City, with the exception of a short sojourn in Bear Lake Valley, and has endured without complaint all of the trials, privations, and hardships incident to the settlement of Utah. She is the mother of 9 children and is well known as the friend of the poor, the nurse of the sick, and the counselor of the friendless and oppressed among the people. And it is needless to add that she has passed her life in the advocacy and practice of the principles of that gospel which she embraced in the days of her youth. Mrs. Jane S. Richards, wife of the distinguished apostle Franklin D. Richards and daughter of Isaac and Louisa Snyder, was born January 31st, 1823, in Pamelia, Jefferson County, N.Y. The prophet and pilot of her father's house into the church was Elder John E. Page, who brought to them the gospel in 1837 while they were living near Kingston, Canada. The family started thence for Far West, MO, in 1839, but were compelled by sickness to stop at Lawport, Indiana. Here, through the faithful ministrations of her brother Robert, she was restored from the effects of a paralytic stroke and immediately embraced the faith. In the autumn following, 1840, she first saw young Elder Richards, then on his first mission. In 1842, after her father's family had moved to Nauvoo, she was married to Mr. Richards. In the journey of the saints into the wilderness, after their expulsion from Nauvoo, she drank to the bitter dregs the cup of hardship and affliction, her husband being absent on mission and she being repeatedly prostrated with sickness. At winter quarters, President Young said to her, "It may truly be said, if any have come up through great tribulation from Nauvoo, you have." There her little daughter died, and was the first to be interred in that memorable burying ground of the saints. Here also her husband's wife, Elizabeth, died, despite the faithful efforts of friends, and had it not been for their unwearied attentions, Jane also would have sunk under her load of affliction and sorrow. In 1848, Mr. Richards having returned from mission, they gathered to the valley. In 1849, she gave her only sister to her husband in marriage. From that time forth until their removal to Ogden, in 1869, hers was the fortune of a missionary's wife, her husband being almost constantly on mission. In 1872, she accepted the presidency of the Ogden Relief Society, which she has since very acceptably filled. Among the noteworthy items of interest connected with her presidency of the society was the organization of the Young Ladies of Ogden into a branch society for the purpose of retrenchment and economy in dress, moral, mental, and spiritual improvement, etc., which has been most successfully continued and is now collaterally supported by many branch societies in the county. But her labors have not been confined to Ogden alone. She has been appointed to preside over the societies of Weber County, and, as a sample of her efforts, we may instance that she has established the manufacture of homemade straw bonnets and hats, which industry has furnished employment to many. Her heart and home have ever been open to the wants of the needy, and the sick and afflicted have been the objects of her continual care. The closing words of the wife of Apostle Woodruff at the Grand Mass meeting of the women of Utah have in them a ring strongly suggestive of what must have been the style of speech of those women of America who urged their husbands and sons to resist the tyranny of George III, throw off the yoke of colonial servitude, and prove themselves worthy of national independence. Phoebe W. Carter was born in Scarborough, in the state of Maine, March 8, 1807. Her father was of English descent, connecting with America at about the close of the 17th century. Her mother, Sarah Fabian, was of the same place and 3 generations from England. The name of Fabian was one of the noblest names of Rome, ere England was a nation, and that lofty tone and strength of character so marked in the wife of Apostle Woodruff was doubtless derived from the Fabians, Phoebe being of her mother's stamp. In the year 1834, she embraced the gospel, and, about a year after, left her parents and kindred and journeyed to Kirtland, a distance of 1,000 miles alone made, sustained only by a lofty faith and trust in Israel's God. In her characteristic Puritan language, she says, "My friends marveled at my course, as did I, but something within impelled me on. My mother's grief at my leaving home was almost more than I could bear, and had it not been for the spirit within, I should have faltered at the last. My mother told me she would rather see me buried than going thus alone out into the heartless world. Phoebe," she said, impressively, "will you come back to me if you find Mormonism false?" I answered, "Yes, mother, I will," thrice. These were my words, and she knew I would keep my promise. My answer relieved her trouble, but it cost us all much sorrow to part. When the time came for my departure, I dared not trust myself to say farewell, so I wrote my goodbyes to each, and leaving them on my table, ran downstairs and jumped into the carriage. Thus I left the beloved home of my childhood to link my life with the saints of God. When I arrived in Kirtland, I became acquainted with the prophet Joseph Smith and received more evidence of his divine mission. There in Kirtland, I formed the acquaintance of Elder Wilford Woodruff, to whom I was married in 1836. With him, I went to the islands of the sea and to England on missions. When the principle of polygamy was first taught, I thought it the most wicked thing I ever heard of. Consequently, I opposed it to the best of my ability until I became sick and wretched. As soon, however, as I became convinced that it originated as a revelation from God through Joseph, and knowing him to be a prophet, I wrestled with my Heavenly Father in fervent prayer to be guided aright at that all-important moment of my life. The answer came. Peace was given to my mind. I knew it was the will of God, and from that time to the present I have sought to faithfully honor the patriarchal law. Of Joseph, my testimony is that he was one of the greatest prophets the Lord ever called, that he lived for the redemption of mankind and died a martyr for the truth. The love of the saints for him will never die. It was after the martyrdom of Joseph that I accompanied my husband to England in 1845. On our return, the advance companies of the saints had just left Nauvoo under President Young and others of the 12. We followed immediately and journeyed to winter quarters. The next year, Wilford went with the pioneers to the mountains, while the care of the family devolved on me. After his return and the reorganization of the First Presidency, I accompanied my husband on his mission to the eastern states. In 1850, we arrived in the valley, and since that time Salt Lake City has been my home. Of my husband, I can truly say, I have found him a worthy man, with scarcely his equal on earth. He has built up a branch wherever he has labored. He has been faithful to God and his family every day of his life. My respect for him has increased with our years, and my desire for an eternal union with him will be the last wish of my mortal life. Sister Phoebe is one of the noblest of her sex, a mother in Israel. And in her strength of character, consistency, devotion, and apostolic caste, she is second to none. A most worthy peer of Sister Woodruff was Leonora, the wife of Apostle John Taylor. She was the daughter of Captain Cannon of the Isle of Man, England, and sister of the father of George Q. Cannon. She left England for Canada as a companion to the wife of the Secretary of the Colony, but with the intention of returning. While in Canada, however, she met Elder Taylor, then a Methodist minister, whose wife she afterwards became. They were married in 1833. She was a God-fearing woman and, as we have seen, was the first to receive Parley P. Pratt into her house when on his mission to Canada. In the spring of 1838, she gathered with her husband and 2 children to Kirtland. Thence they journeyed to Far West. She was in the expulsion from Missouri, bore the burden of her family in Nauvoo as a missionary's wife, while her husband was in England, felt the stroke of the martyrdom, in which her husband was terribly wounded, was in the Exodus, was then left at winter quarters while her husband went on his second mission to England, but he returned in time for them to start with the first companies that followed the pioneers. Sister Leonora was therefore among the earliest women of Utah. When the prospect came, at the period of the Utah War, that the saints would have to leave American soil, and her husband delivered those grand patriotic discourses to his people that will ever live in Mormon history, Sister Taylor nobly supported his determination with the rest of the saints to put the torch to their homes, rather than submit to invasion and the renunciation of their liberties. She died in the month of December, 1867. Hers was a faithful example, and she has left an honored memory among her people. Marion Ross, wife of Apostle Orson Pratt, is a native of Scotland and was reared among the Highlands. When about 17 years of age, she visited her relatives in Edinburgh, where Mormonism was first brought to her attention. She was shortly afterwards baptized near the harbor of Leith on the 27th of August, 1847. A singular feature of Mrs. Pratt's experience was that in a dream she was distinctly shown her future husband, then on his mission to Scotland. When she saw him, she at once recognized him. She made her home at Apostle Pratt's house in Liverpool for a short time and then emigrated to America in 1851. After being in Salt Lake City a few months, she was married to Mr. Pratt. She testifies, "I have been in polygamy 25 years and have never seen the hour when I have regretted that I was in it. I would not change my position for anything earthly, no matter how grand and gorgeous it might be, even were it for the throne of a queen. For surety do I know that my Redeemer liveth, and that he is a prayer-hearing and prayer-answering God." Another of these apostolic women, who with their husbands founded Utah, is the wife of Albert Carrington. She was also in the valley in 1847. Her grand example and words to Captain Van Vliet, when the saints were resolving on another exodus, have been already recorded. A volume written could not make her name more imperishable. Nor must Artemisia, the first wife of Erastus Snow, who is so conspicuous among the founders of St. George, be forgotten. She is one of the honorable women of Utah, and the part she has sustained, with her husband, in building up the southern country, has been that of self-sacrifice, endurance, and noble example. Mention should also be made of Elizabeth, daughter of the late Bishop Hoagland, and first wife of George Q. Cannon. She has borne the burden of the day as a missionary's wife, and has also accompanied her husband on mission to England. But her most noteworthy example was in her truly noble conduct in standing by her husband in those infamous persecutions of the politicians over the question of polygamy, in their efforts to prevent him taking his seat in Congress. Here let us also speak of the death of Sister Violet Kimball, whose history has been given somewhat at length in previous chapters. After sharing with her husband and the saints the perils and hardships of the Exodus and the journey across the plains, and after many years of usefulness to her family and friends, she died October 22, d. 1867. She was mourned by none more sincerely than by her husband, who, according to his words, spoken over her remains, was, not long after her,